formally until 1890, at precisely the moment where this census data comes online. And it wasn't just because sociology comes out in the service of figuring out who black people are. In fact, it coincides with a larger problem, not that black people weren't a big enough problem, but a larger problem tied to industrialization and immigration and economic disruption. One of the ways in which the slavery problem coincides perfectly with the larger economic future of the nation is that the whole point of ending slavery from some northern perspective was to put the nation on a universal wage labor-based economy. And so all those forces pressing for wage labor as the singular form of work in America is part of the industrial moment of harnessing fossil fuels to steam power, to electricity, to the coal age. So all of that matters. And so the sociologists come online in this country in the wake of the Second Industrial Revolution because they're trying to figure out how do you control a population, study that population to make sure that they are suitable for an industrial economy. Some of them who became progressives were interested in providing as much social support as possible to stabilize the disruptions that people felt in terms of what the work experience was like as a wage slave from the left's point of view. If you were conservative, if you were someone like Herbert Spencer, who was given credit for being the early founder of sociology, was someone who defined the language of the survival of the fittest by essentially saying, hire one, kill them, hire another. Like, if the individual or the group that individual represents does not have the stuff of our industrial economy, then there's something wrong with them. So we only want the best of our industrial labor force, which fed into a logic that later gets called social Darwinism, which translates into eugenics projects, which is about breeding the best type, in this case, mostly of white European ancestry, as opposed to African. We weren't even considered relevant to the eugenic project, essentially. Although in the South, that's not exactly true. There was more complexity to it. But most of the eugenics movement was happening outside of the South. It was happening in Europe and in America. And it was about certain kinds of white peasant European populations that were unworthy or undesirable. So all of that is happening at precisely this moment where statistics, demographers of the race problem, who are a really small group of people, but incredibly influential at this time, because this is brand new, this is a brand new research field, like for you graduate students, like this is terrible. Could you imagine being part of that generation where you get to define race scholarship because there's nobody else doing it? Like imagine now today, you know, you gotta cut off your little slice of a slice of a slice of a slice to think that you have something new to contribute to our collective knowledge. Well, back then it was wide open because these people were new. Even to study them was for them to be objectified through the lens of sociology and certain forms of science was a form of privilege. Because you didn't need to spend a whole lot of brain power determining where they fit in the human ecology. If in fact it wasn't. Okay, so I spent too much time on that. This first census had a couple of findings. Had to do with high birth rates, which were scary to demographers of that period. These black people produced a lot of babies, and what are we going to do about that? The footnote to that was that they also died fairly young ages and at greater numbers than their white peers due to disease, particularly tuberculosis and other forms of contagious disease. And that was considered good news because they could look at they could anticipate the future and see, well, as long as they continue to die at these rates, we won't have to worry too much about the birth rate. This was received with a sigh of relief, actually. But they noticed something else. They noticed that with this generational cohort, these 25-year-olds, a lot of them were going to prison. Turns out 30% of the entire prison population, the vast majority of which was in the South, were young black men, same cohort we're talking about today, were in prison at a rate nearly 3 times their rate in the general population. So let's just fast forward to today. Let's just fast forward right now. If we just stop there and we substitute 1890 for 2010, it's actually 12% of the population is about 40% in the nation's prisons. If we flattened out history, if you were a Martian and showed up here and looked at the data, and you compared that to this, you'd say, oh, well, it's just, same population. They've been up to no good for a long time, up to a little bit more no good more recently. Why would you keep those people around? I mean, that's what this information can communicate. It simplifies. But what do you know about that 30% number? I've already given you the answer. How would you disaggregate the number? So if you just took the 30%, what would you say represents the percentage of that 30% that is actual hardcore, dangerous, psychopathic people in society who got exactly what they deserve? What number would you offer? 0.1%. You don't know. What number would you offer for the people who, when they went to put their bale of cotton on the hook as a sharecropper, and the white owner tipped the balance in their favor, and they said, man, you're cheating me. And he said, get out of my face. And those words turned to blows, and the white man ended up dead. And that individual ended up in prison for murder. What percentage of that number would that be? What percentage of the number would it be for the African-American domestic woman who is being touched by the white male homeowner and decided to walk off the job that day because she wouldn't degrade herself? And she was picked up along the way by the local sheriff after the white homeowner called and said, she no longer works for me, she's a vagrant. And the laws against vagrancy were no different than New York laws like stop and frisk, where if you're not accounted for, you don't have ID, you're going to jail. Now, of course, most young people in New York today subject to stop and frisk. The vast majority of them black and brown. In fact, there were 177,000. We'll throw out some numbers here because these have a story. 177,000 14 to 18-year-olds, black and Latino, in all of New York City, and 125,000 of them were stopped last year. I mean, think about that. We're talking about 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Black and brown youth. The vast majority of them stopped and questioned by the police, asked for ID, asked where they're going, patted down, thrown up against the wall. What percentage of our criminal justice system today would you say represents young people whose lights dimmed in the wake of that experience and ended up in prison for one reason or another? Who do you blame for that? How do you account for that? So with that black woman who challenged and left the job, becomes a vagrant, she's a statistic. She shows up in this number. But this number was not meant to start a conversation about sexual predation by white male homeowners or the corruptions of a political economy that was deliberately designed to exploit enterprising free black folk who were trying to make good on the promises of their freedom. This is not a story about black folks who signed up to support the Republican Party and went to cast a ballot and were shot at by the Ku Klux Klan, and when they shot back were arrested for attempted murder. This was not the beginning of that conversation. This was not about political and social analysis that would lead to any kinds of conclusions or findings that would expose that. This number was meant to say, aha, we've got it. We found it. We have the smoking gun. We can now prove that these people are dangerous, that they are prone to criminal behavior, and that slavery had restrained their aberrant passions, their criminal tendencies. And now that they are no longer free, we have to create forms of social control that will limit the danger and threat that they pose to us. And guess what? And we can do this as a colorblind, race-neutral project, because we're not racist to be afraid of people who've shown themselves to be criminal, to be dangerous in our society. Not unlike our conversation on public safety today. We can support all sorts of things today in the name of public safety. Whether it's profiling Muslims in Newark, New Jersey, little girls going to school, potential terrorists, getting money from Homeland Security under Eric Holder right now, and it's okay because, well, Who knows which of those little girls is planting or plotting the next attack on America? Who's been to New York lately? I mean, when you see something, say something, it makes you want to vomit. Because the something is way too elastic in our society. And it's usually darker hued. So you get the point. That number tells us very little. It tells us almost nothing. But it served a political project. It is abetting the arrival of Jim Crow. It is the starting point for saying it is okay that those people live in that community, that they don't go to this school, that they don't work here, that we have special surveillance techniques to keep an eye on them. That's where it begins. No surprise then that we're still with it, because it works. And no surprise that the political purposes to which it is put are what they are, because the inventors in that moment are the same people as they are today. They believe that the numbers speak for themselves. They believe that the numbers are race neutral. And where they cannot believe it, where someone as smart as anybody in this room says to them, but how can you account for this? They say, well, show me the data. Well, you can't show the data because the system is not designed to count racism. It's not designed that way. Our best racism data is polling data. It's survey data. It's our ways to trick people into admitting that they're racist. Seriously. So social psychologists have all kinds of inventive and interesting ways to do it. But nobody gives a shit about that data. All they know is that there's black and brown folks behind bars, and they know, of course, the dead bodies in the communities are 90% interracial, which is another conversation, because homicide is, of course, the most authoritative evidence that something happened. There's a chalk outline, bloodstains, concrete, somebody died, and somebody did. But even that story is insufficient to the problem of the relationship between our social structures that kill people softly, right, like Roberta Flack says, a little bit every day, where the value of human life is deliberately devalued in certain communities, and that we end up with certain results where we know someone did it, and we know they were black, and then we pass judgment and finger wag at that outcome as if we have nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. Suicide is the most common form of death by gun in this country. And suicide was, in fact, a big problem back then. So much so that one of the major progenitors of this use of statistics, this language of universal condemnation of black people, knew that suicide was a problem and that white people were killing themselves at record numbers. What did he make of that information? What did he do with that? To quote him deliberately, to quote him explicitly, I should say, he said that suicide, like statistics of insanity, so admissions to mental hospitals, and statistics of crime, he put all three together, were indicative of something fundamentally wrong in society. That it was reflective of a cancer at the root of our social contract, that this many people, year after year, would take their own lives. This same progenitor said just the opposite with statistics of black criminality. That the statistics of black people committing crimes was evidence of their racial tendencies, their proclivities to do harm to each other and to others. That's where the social and political analysis comes into play. That's the interpretation. That's where the narrative is defined using the information, but it's a political project. And if you cede the power of the counter-narrative, if you cede the power of the political project, then someone else will tell the story. Sometimes it's just easy for them to cite the number. Sometimes they wrap it up in information. I'll mention these quickly. Black crime and rape in the South was part of the pre-existing language of black male threats to white womanhood. That didn't rely as heavily on crime statistics, but was easily inserted back into this frame as the evidence of the problem if we didn't deal with this proof of their criminality. So to say it a different way, this number proved that black men in particular